The great obsession of the 19th century was, as we know, history, with its themes of development and of suspension, of crisis and cycle, themes of the ever accumulating past, with its great preponderance of dead men and menacing glaciation of the world. The 19th century found its essential mythological resources in the second principle of thermodynamics. The present epoch will perhaps be above all the epoch of space. We are in the epoch of simultaneity. We are in the epoch of juxtaposition, the epoch of the near and far, of the side by side, of the dispersed. We are at a moment, I believe, when our experience of the world is less that of a long life developing through time than that of a network which connects points and intersects with its own scheme. One could perhaps say that the certain ideological conflicts animating present day polemics oppose the pious descendants of time and the determined inhabitants of space. Structuralism, or at least which is grouped under this slightly too general name, is the effort to establish between elements that could have been connected on a temporal axis an ensemble of relations that makes them appear as juxtaposed, set off against one another, implicated by each other. That makes them appear, in short, as a sort of configuration. Actually, structuralism does not entail denial of time. It does involve a certain manner of dealing with what we call time and what we call history. Yet it is necessary to notice that the space which today appears to form the horizon of our concerns, our theory, our systems, is not an innovation. Space itself has a history in Western experience, and it is not possible to disregard the fatal intersection of time with space. One could say, by way of retracing this history of space very roughly, that in the Middle Ages there was a hierarchic ensemble of places, sacred places and profound plates, protected places and open, exposed places, urban places and rural places. All of these concern the real life of men. In cosmological theory, there were supercelestial places as opposed to the celestial, and the celestial place was in turn opposed to the terrestrial place. There were places where things had been put because they had been violently displaced. And then, on the contrary, places where things found their natural ground and stability. It was this complete hierarchy, this opposition, this intersection of place that constituted what could be very roughly be called the medieval space, the space of emplacement. The space of emplacement was opened up by Galileo. For the real scandal of Galileo's work lay not so much in his discovery or rediscovery that the Earth revolved around the sun, but in his constitution of an infinite and infinitely open space. In such a space, the place of the Middle Ages turned out to be dissolved, as it were. A thing's place was no longer anything but a point in its movement, just as the stability of a thing was only its movement indefinitely slowed down. In other words, starting with Galileo in the 17th century, extension was substituted for localization. Today, the site has been substituted for extension, which itself has replaced emplacement. The site is defined by relations of proximity between points or elements. Formally, we can describe these relations as series, trees, or grids. Moreover, the importance of the site as a problem in contemporary technical work is well known. The storage of data or of an intermediate results of a calculation in the memory of a machine, the circulation of discrete elements with random output, automobile traffic is a simple case, or indeed the sounds on a telephone line. The identification of marked or coded elements inside a set that may be randomly distributed, or may be arranged according to a single or to multiple classifications. In a still more concrete manner, the problem of siting or placement arises for mankind in terms of demography. This problem of the human site or living space is not simply that of knowing whether there will be enough space for men in the world, a problem that is certainly quite important, but also that of knowing what relations of propinquity, what type of storage, circulation, marking, and classification of human elements should be adopted in a given situation in order to achieve a given end? Our epoch is one in which space takes for us the form of relations among sites. In any case, I believe that the anxiety of our era has to do fundamentally with space. No doubt a great deal more than with time. Time probably appears to us as one of the various distributive operations that are possible for the elements that are spread out in space. Now, despite all the techniques for appropriating space, despite the whole network of knowledge that enables us to delimit or to formalize, contemporary space is perhaps still not entirely desanctified. Apparently, unlike time, it would seem, which was detached from the sacred in the 19th century, to be sure, a certain theoretical desanctification of space, the one signaled by Galileo's work, has occurred, but we may still not have reached the point of a practical desanctification of space. And perhaps our life is still governed by a certain number of oppositions that remain inviolable, that our institutions and practices have not yet dared to break down. These are oppositions that we regard as simple givens. For example, between private space and public space, between family space and social space, between cultural space and useful space, between the space of leisure and that of work. All these are still nurtured by the hidden presence of the sacred. Bechelard's monumental work and the descriptions of phenomenologists have taught us that we do not live in a homogeneous and empty space, but on the contrary, in a space thoroughly imbued with quantities and perhaps thoroughly phantasmatic as well. The space of our primary perception, the space of our dreams, and that of our passions hold within themselves qualities that seem intrinsic. There is a light, ethereal, transparent space, or again a dark, rough, encumbered space, a space from above, of summits, or on the contrary, a space from below of mud, or again a space that could be flowing like sparkling water, or space that is fixed, congealed like stone or crystal. Yet these analyses, while fundamental for reflection in our time, primarily concern internal space. I should like to speak now of external space, the space in which we live, which draws us out of ourselves, in which the erosion of our lives, our time, and our history occurs. The space which claws and gnaws at us is also in itself a heterogeneous space. In other words, we do not live in a kind of void inside of which we could place individuals and things. We do not live inside a void that could be colored with diverse shades of light. We live inside a set of relations that delineate sites which are irreducible to one another and absolutely not superimposable on one another. Of course, one might attempt to describe these different sites by looking for the set of relations by which a given site can be defined. For example, describing the set of relations that define the sites of transportation, streets, trains. A train is an extraordinary bundle of relations because it is something through which one goes. It is also something by means of which one can go from one point to another, and then it is also something that goes by. One could describe, via the cluster of relations that allow them to be defined, the sites of temporary relaxation, cafes, cinemas, beaches. One could also describe via its network of relations the closed or semi-closed sites of rest, the house, the bedroom, the bed, etc. But among all these sites, I am interested in certain ones that have the curious property of being in relation with all other sites, but in such a way as to suspect, neutralize, or invert the set of relations that they happen to designate, mirror, or reflect. These spaces, as it were, which are linked with all the others, which, however, contradict all the other sites, are of two main types. First, there are utopias. Utopias are sites with no real place. They are sites with a general relation of direct or inverted analogy with the real space of society. They present society in a perfected form, or else society turned upside down. But in any case, these utopias are fundamentally unreal places. There are also, probably in every culture, in every civilization, real places, places that do not exist and that are formed in the very founding of society, which are something like counter sites, a kind of effectively enacted utopia in which the real sites, all the other real sites that can be found within our culture, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. Places of this kind are outside of all places, even though it may be possible to indicate their location in reality. because these places are absolutely different from all the sites that they reflect and speak about. I shall call them by the way of contrast to utopias, heterotopias. I believe that between utopias and these quiet other sites, these heterotopias, there may be a sort of mixed, joint experience, which would be the mirror. The mirror is, after all, a utopia, since it is a placeless place. In the mirror, I see myself there where I am not, in an unreal virtual space that opens up behind the surface. I am over there where I am not, a sort of shadow that gives my own visibility to myself, that enables me to see myself there where I am absent. Such is the utopia of the mirror. But it is also a heterotopia insofar as the mirror does exist in reality, where it exerts a sort of counteraction on the position that I occupy. From the standpoint of the mirror, I discover my absence from the place where I am, since I see myself over there. Starting from this gaze, that is, as it were directed towards me, from the ground of this virtual space that is on the other side of the glass, I come back towards myself. I begin again to direct my eyes towards myself and to reconstitute myself where I am. The mirror functions as a heterotopia in this respect. It makes this place that I occupy at the moment when I look at myself in the glass at once absolutely real, connected with all the space that surrounds it, and absolutely unreal, since in order to be perceived, it has to pass through this virtual point, which is over there. As for the heterotopias as such, how can they be described? What meaning do they have? We might imagine a sort of systematic description. I do not say a science because the term is too galvanized now. That would, in a given society, take as its object the study, analysis, description, and reading, as some would like to say nowadays, of different spaces, of these other places, as a sort of simultaneously mythic and real contestation of the space in which we live. This description could be called a heterotopology. Its first principle is that there is probably not a single culture in the world that fails to constitute heterotopias. That is a constant of every human group. But the heterotopias obviously take quite varied forms, and perhaps no one absolutely universal form of heterotopia would be found. We can, however, class them in two main categories. In the so-called primitive societies, there is a certain form of heterotopia that I would call crisis heterotopias, i.e., there are privileged or sacred or forbidden places reserved for individuals who are, in relation to society and to the human environment in which they live, in a state of crisis. Adolescents, menstruating women, pregnant women, the elderly, etc. In our society, these crisis heterotopias are persistently disappearing, though a few remnants can still be found. For example, the boarding school, in its 19th century form, or military service for young men, have certainly played such a role, as the first manifestations of sexual virility were in fact supposed to take place elsewhere than at home. For girls, there was, until the middle of the 20th century, a tradition called the honeymoon trip, which was an ancestral theme. The young woman's deflowering could take place nowhere, and at the moment of its occurrence, the train or honeymoon hotel was indeed the place of this nowhere, this heterotopia without geographical markers. But these heterotopias of crisis are disappearing today and are being replaced, I believe, by what we might call heterotopias of deviation, those in which individuals whose behavior is deviant in relation to the required mean or norm are placed. Cases of this are rest homes or psychiatric hospitals, and of course, prisons. And one should perhaps add retirement homes that are, as it were, on the borderline between the heterotopia of crisis and the heterotopia of deviation, since, after all, old age is a crisis, but it is also a deviation, since in our society where leisure is the rule, idleness is a sort of deviation. The second principle of this description of heterotopias is that a society, as its history unfolds, can make existing heterotopias function in a very different fashion. For each heterotopia has a precise and determined function within a society, and the same heterotopia can, according to the synchronia of the culture in which it occurs, have one function or another. As an example, I shall take the strange heterotopia of the cemetery. The cemetery is certainly a place unlike ordinary cultural spaces. It is a space that is, however, connected with all the sites of the city, state, or society or village, since each individual, each family has relatives in the cemetery. In Western culture, the cemetery has practically always existed, but it has undergone important changes. Until the end of the 18th century, the cemetery was placed at the heart of the city, next to the church. In it, there was a hierarchy of possible tombs. There was the charnel house in which bodies lost the last traces of individuality. There were a few individual tombs, and then there were tombs inside the church. These later tombs were themselves of two types, either simply tombstones with an inscription or mausoleums with statues. This cemetery house inside the sacred space of the church has taken on a quite different cast in modern civilizations. And curiously, it is in a time when civilization has become atheistic, as one says very crudely, that Western culture has established what is termed the cult of the dead. Basically, it was quite natural that in a time of real belief in the resurrection of bodies and the immortality of the soul, overriding importance was not accorded to the body's remains. On the contrary, from the moment when people are no longer sure that they have a soul or that the body will regain life, it is perhaps necessary to give much more attention to the dead body, which is ultimately the only trace of our existence in the world and in language. In any case, it is from the beginning of the 19th century that everyone has a right to her or his own little box, right? His or her own little personal decay. But on the other hand, it is only from the start of the 19th century that cemeteries began to be located at the outside border of cities, in correlation with the individualization of death and the bourgeois appropriation of the cemetery. There arises an obsession with death as an illness. The dead, it is supposed, bring illnesses to the living, and it is the presence and proximity of the dead right beside the houses, next to the church, almost in the middle of the street. It is this proximity that propagates death itself. This major theme of illness spread by the contagion in the cemeteries persisted until the end of the 18th century. Until during the 19th century, the shift of cemeteries towards the suburbs was initiated. The cemeteries then came to constitute no longer the sacred and immortal heart of the city, but the other city, where each family possesses its dark resting place. Third principle. The heterotopia is capable of juxtaposing in a single real place several spaces, several rights that are in themselves incompatible. Thus, it is that the theater brings onto the rectangle of the stage, one after the other, a whole series of places that are foreign to one another. Thus, it is that the cinema is a very odd rectangular room, at the end of which, on a two-dimensional screen, one sees the projection of a three-dimensional space. But perhaps the oldest example of these heterotopias that take the form of contradictory sites is the garden. One must not forget that in the Orient, the garden, an astonishing creation that is now 1,000 years old, had a very deep and seemingly superimposed meaning. The traditional garden of the Persians was a sacred space that was supposed to bring together inside its rectangle 4 parts representing the 4 parts of the world, with a space still more sacred than others that were like the umbisculus, the navel of the world at its center. The basin and the water fountain were there. And all the vegetation of the garden was supposed to come together in this space, in this sort of microcosm. As for carpets, they were originally reproductions of gardens. The garden is a rug onto which the whole world comes to enact its symbolic perfection. And the rug is a sort of garden that can move across space. The garden is the smallest parcel of the world, and then it is the totality of the world. The garden has been a sort of happy, universaling heterotopia since the beginning of antiquity. Our modern zoological gardens spring from that source. Fourth principle. Heterotopias are most often linked to slices in time, which is to say that they open onto what might be termed, for the sake of symmetry, heterochronies. The heterotopia begins to function at full capacity when men arrive at a sort of absolute break with their traditional time. The situation shows us that the cemetery is indeed a highly heterotopic place, since for the individual, the cemetery begins with this strange heterochrony, the loss of life, and with this quasi eternity in which her permanent lot is disillusion and disappearance. From a general standpoint, in a society like ours, heterotopias and heterochronies are structured and distributed in a relatively complex fashion. First of all, there are heterotopias of indefinitely accumulating time. For example, museums and libraries. Museums and libraries have become heterotopias in which time never stops, building up and topping its own summit. Whereas in the 17th century, even at the end of the century, museums and libraries were the expression of an individual choice. By contrast, the idea of accumulating everything, of establishing a sort of general archive, the will to enclose in one place all times, all epochs, all forms, all tastes, the idea of constituting a place of all times that is itself outside of time and inaccessible to its ravages. The project of organizing in this way a sort of perpetual and indefinite accumulation of time in a mobile place. The whole idea belongs to our modernity. The museum and the library are heterotopias that are proper to Western culture of the 19th century. Opposite these heterotopias that are linked to the accumulation of time, there are those linked, on the contrary, to time in its most flowing, transitory, precarious aspect, to time in the mode of the festival. These heterotopias are not orientated toward the eternal, they are rather absolutely temporal. Such, for example, are the fairgrounds, these marvelous empty sites on the outskirts of cities that teem once or twice a year with stands, displays, heteroclite objects, wrestlers, snake women, fortune tellers, and so forth. Quite recently, a new kind of temporal heterotopia has been invented: vacation villages, such as those Polynesian villages that offer a compact 3 weeks of primitive and eternal nudity to the inhabitants of the cities. You see, moreover, that through the two forms of heterotopias that come together here, the heterotopia of the festival and that of the eternity of the accumulating time, the huts of Djerba are in a sense relatives of libraries and museums, for the rediscovery of Polynesian life abolishes time. Yet the experience is just as much the rediscovery of time. It is as if the entire history of humanity, reaching back to its origin, were accessible in a sort of immediate knowledge. Fifth principle. Heterotopias always presuppose a system of opening and closing that both isolates them and makes them penetrable. In general, the heterotopic state is not freely accessible like a public place. Either the entry is compulsory, as in the case of entering a barracks or prison, or else the individual has to submit to rites and purifications. To get in, one must have a certain permission and make certain gestures. Moreover, there are even heterotopias that are entirely consecrated to these activities of purification. Purification that is partly religious and partly hygienic, such as the Hammam of the Muslims, or else purification that appears to be slightly hygienic, as in Scandinavian saunas. There are others, on the contrary, that seem to be pure and simple openings that generally hide curious exclusions. Everyone can enter into heterotopic sites, but in fact, this is only an illusion. We think we enter where we are, but the very fact that we enter excluded. I'm thinking, for example, of the famous bedrooms that existed on the great farms of Brazil and elsewhere in South America. The entry door did not lead into the central room where the family lived, and every individual or traveler who came by had the right to open this door, to enter the bedroom and to sleep there for a night. Now, these bedrooms were such that the individual who went into them never had access to the family's quarters. The visitor was absolutely the guest in transit, was not really the invited guest. This type of heterotopia, which has practically disappeared from our civilizations, could perhaps be found in the famous American motel rooms where a man goes with his car and his mistress, and where illicit sex is both absolutely sheltered and absolutely hidden, kept isolated without, however, being allowed out in the open. The sixth principle. The last trait of heterotopias is that they have a function in relation to all the space that remains. This function unfolds between two extreme poles. Either their role is to create a space of illusion that exposes every real space, all the sites inside of which human life is partitioned, as still more illusory. Perhaps that is the role that was played by the famous brothels of which we are now deprived. Or else, on the contrary, their role is to create a space that is other, another real space, as perfect, as meticulous, as well arranged as ours is messy, ill constructed, and jumbled. The later type would be the heterotopia, not of illusion, but of compensation. And I wonder if certain colonies have not functioned somewhat in this manner. In certain cases, they have played, on the level of the general organization of terrestrial space, the role of heterotopias. I am thinking, for example, of the first wave of colonization in the 17th century, of the Puritan societies that the English had founded in America and that were absolutely perfect other places. I am also thinking of this extraordinary Jesuit colonies that were founded in South America. Marvelous, absolutely relegated colonies in which human perfection was effectively achieved. The Jesuits of Paraguay established colonies in which existence was relegated at every turn. The village was laid out according to a rigorous plan around a rectangle place, at the foot of which was the church. On one side, there was the school, and the other side, the cemetery. And then in front of the church, an avenue set out that crossed at right angles. Each family had its little cabin along these two accesses, and thus the sign of Christ was exactly reproduced. Christianity marked the space and geography of the American world with its fundamental sign. The daily life of individuals was regulated not by the whistle, but by the bell. Everyone was awakened at the same time. Everyone began work at the same time. Meals were at noon and 5 o'clock. Then came bedtime. And at midnight came what was called the martial wake up. That is, at the chime of the church bell, each person carried out her/his duty. Brothels and colonies are two extreme types of heterotopia, and if we think, after all, that the boat is a floating piece of space, a place without a place, that exists by itself, that is closed in on itself, and at the same time is given over to the affinity of the sea, and that from port to port, from tack to tack, from brothel to brothel, it goes as far as the colonies in search of the most precious treasures they conceal in their gardens. You will understand why the boat has not only been for our civilization, from the 16th century until the present, the great instrument of economic development. I have not been speaking of that today, but has been simultaneously the greatest reserve of imagination. The ship is the heterotopia par excellence. In civilizations without boats, dreams dry up. Espionage takes the place of adventure, and the police take the place of pirates.